So that's quite a story.
Yeah. But also, let me just thank you guys for having me and welcoming me into your community. I really appreciate it and the opportunity to talk about this as well.
So just to dispel any wonderings that anybody might have, you don't have a particular dog in the evangelical Christianity fight. You are not trying to offer propaganda on behalf of the church, right? That's not really your background.
No, not even remotely close. And I mean, you've followed, my Twitter and my career. I don't really live that sort of lifestyle, I would say.
Okay, all right. So you come to us today, of all days, with our current administration floating the idea that we would end all foreign aid to the Northern Triangle. And that the president is openly floating the idea of shutting off all ports of entry into the United States. So, you've come here, and we thank you for putting a human face on people in El Salvador. They are real people with real struggles, real obvious struggles, and for also giving a face to gang members and the incarcerated. And those certainly are people that are easy to dismiss from our point of view. So why would someone join a gang in El Salvador?
I think, obviously, I do believe in personal responsibility and all that, but I think people are also products of their environments and of their circumstances. El Salvador is an insanely poor country. There is a complete lack of opportunity there. A lot of these neighborhoods that these guys come from are completely forgotten, under-resourced. There's really no way. It's called no way out in terms of leaving the gang, but there's no way out for them in general in terms of opportunity, in terms of feeding their family, in terms of having any sort of hope or way to survive. So a lot of them turn to the gangs, especially at young ages. They're recruited at 8, 9, 10 years old. They're in these communities which are, pretty harsh places. So a lot of them come from broken families, dysfunctional families. You can see the first pastor we spoke to was addicted to drugs at 9 years old, living on the streets. I mean, some of these guys didn't have families. The guy who we show at the end, who was just covered, his entire face covered in tattoos, he did not have a family. He was a street kid. So you get these opportunities to earn even a few dollars a day, and you're 8 or 9 years old, and you can't really make decisions between, I'm either going to eat or I'm going to join this organization that offers me some sort of guidance, friendship, brotherhood. So the choice is pretty stark, and I think you find a lot of people who, have to make a decision without really understanding the consequences of the decision that they're making, and who feel like they don't have any other option.
So, for the people that you're covering in this story who are converting to Christianity and to church life, are there similarities between the structure they would find in a gang and the structure that they find in the church environment?
Yeah, I think so, and there's a great analyst who studied the gangs for years who makes this case called Stephen Dudley, that the church represents, obviously, they have different agendas, but, the church has a hierarchy, it has a brotherhood there for them, it has rules that they have to abide by, and it gives them a structure that the only other thing that might have done that is the gangs. Of course, I think this is a much more positive structure, and the consequences are a little less harsh, than the gangs are. But yeah, it gives them, a sense that they've only found elsewhere in the gang, which is a community. There are no communities for these guys when they're growing up in their environments that they live in. Nothing that welcomes them in, nothing that is like, these guys are going to look out for you and they're going to protect you and they're going to give you a sense of belonging. So as different as those institutions are, the gangs and the church, there are some similarities there in what they provide. And
so, if you don't follow the rules of the gang, just to make that clear, the consequences are?
They very well likely could be death.
Okay.
Definitely going to be violence and harsh consequences.
And the gentleman close to the end of your story there was talking about the consequences of not following his rules. Mm-hmm. So what are those consequences? He said you're going to be out of here. So what does that mean?
So, I don't know if he has kicked anyone out for a fact, but I think he's definitely asked people to leave. Wilfredo's under a lot of pressure because he's operating in a gang neighborhood, right? It's his gang. It's his former gang, the 18th Street, and they are accepting of people who are leaving. But they're not really, they're not like really positive about it. They don't want people to leave the gang. So he's got to walk a very fine line between both the police, who don't believe these guys to start with, the gang whose community he's inside of, and the opposing gangs, right? So these guys aren't completely off limits. They still could suffer some consequences. So if any of those three communities, any of those three organizations, the police and both gangs, even get a suspicion that some of the guys living within Wilfredo's church aren't abiding by the church rules, aren't serious about their conversion, there's going to be consequences that could be extremely harsh. So he has to keep a really firm hand. I mean, he's very tolerant and very accepting of these guys and the backgrounds they've lived in, but he also has to make sure that they really abide by the laws that the church has put out, and evangelicalism, which can be very strict. So he's sort of caught in a way where he can't be too tolerant, because it could come back on him and on the organization that he's built.
But why would 18th Street or MS-13 ever permit someone to leave their ranks in order to follow a religious life?
It's a really good question, and I don't have an answer that's 100%. The church has always played a very strong role in El Salvador. Typically, it was the Catholic Church. If you look at the Salvadoran Civil War, it really kicked off when Archbishop Romero, who I think became a saint recently, who was a preacher of liberation theology, got assassinated because he was preaching for the poor in El Salvador and for the common person there, and that was not well received by the government and by the oligarchy there. So the church has always been really tied in with the poor and with the community there. It's one of the few institutions that really is active in these poor communities. They've also been at the forefront of negotiations between the gangs themselves and the government when it comes to ceasefires and truces and things like that. So they are a well-respected institution. And like I said, it's not, I don't want to give the portrayal that it's just like, well, these guys are out, we respect it, let it go. They do allow them to leave. They do allow these organizations to operate, but it's not 100%, right? These organizations still have to walk a very fine line in how they preach, how they welcome guys that get out of the gang. They can't be too forceful, I think. We actually went walking around Distrito Italia with a pastor who's actually not in the film, who was not a gang member, but preaches to a lot of these guys. And he was going door to door preaching, and he's got to be very careful about who he preaches to and how he preaches to them, because you still have to be wary. But yeah, there is this level of respect that the church has in these communities that I would say no other organization has. Even NGOs, even doctors who want to go in there and do a sort of Doctors Without Borders things, they can't get the access and the acceptance that the church has in these communities.
So how did you get permission to do this story?
Well, we went through the church, because there was no other way. I mean, Wilfredo is kind of become a bit of a media darling, so they're pretty well known, but you still have to get permission. When you drive into these communities, you still have to roll your windows down and show people that you're a journalist and you're coming in there and you're a foreigner, that you don't represent a threat of any kind, that you're not up to no good. In the first community, in the MS-13 community, we went through this first pastor, who then introduced us to the second pastor, and once it was cleared with both of them, we were allowed in the community, but we still weren't allowed to shoot anything else in the community. We could not walk around with our cameras. The gang members saw us and were like, no cameras here. And we're like, we understand, we respect you. We're not going to push any sort of, you're not going to push them. You're not going to take advantage of the opportunities that they've given to you. So it comes through negotiating with them. And there were some days when they're like, look, it's a little harsh today. The police were around. We don't want to raise any suspicions. Please don't come in today. So it still was a fine line that we had to walk in terms of getting permission.
Yeah.
And there was one situation, well, I didn't cover it in the film, but me and my partner, there was like a little fair of sorts where they had a couple booths that were set up for hypertension and checking children's, eyes and things like that. And we had strayed a bit from the church, and we got a pretty stern warning of you guys can't walk any further from here, otherwise there's going to be consequences.
So this is, just to relate this back to the scripture reading, this is very much a younger brother focus so far, what we've talked about, right?
I would say so.
In that the story of the prodigal son, we often will interpret it as a story that is about grace for the one who has strayed from the tracks. And that isn't it wonderful, isn't it beautiful that the father in the story, who from a Christian perspective we usually interpret as being God or like God, who would welcome back the brother who has strayed. and doesn't even ask any questions. The younger brother can't even get his confession out in order to seek out forgiveness. The father just forgives him immediately and throws a party, and everything is wonderful. And Amy Jill Levine, who's a Jewish scholar who teaches New Testament at Vanderbilt, says that that's a fine interpretation, but it's not necessarily how Jesus told it, and it probably wasn't how people heard it in the first century. It's an archetypal story, much like Jacob and Esau or Joseph and his brothers. The brothers always make up in the end, and in this story they do not. The older brother is still hopping mad at the end that the younger brother was welcomed in this fashion, right? And so Levine says that if you look at the story of the prodigal son through a particular lens, the father is a sucker. A complete and utter sucker. He gives away more than he needs to begin with. He doesn't ask questions at the end. And then he tries to tell the older brother, essentially, don't worry about it. And there's that line at the end where the older brother reveals, potentially, the nature of the younger brother's sin. He says, he's devoured your property with prostitutes. And if you read that word for word in the Greek, it says, he is the one who has eaten up your life with whores. He has eaten up your life with whores. The older brother's pouting is not simply a matter of pettiness, right? He is livid at how he thinks stupid his father has been. His father way has worked him like a dog with little reward, and then gives it all away again when the little brother comes home. That's not restorative justice if there's no accounting, there's no truth and reconciliation, there's no attempt at making amends. And so I say all of this because when we come back to El Salvador and we look at this story that you're portraying, not from the view of the younger brother, but from the older brother, right? That it's all well and good for gang members to be seeking out restoration and redemption. But there are considerable amounts of people whom they have harmed along the way, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, your experience of restoration and redemption?
That's a great question. These are also, topics that I didn't get to get into in this film, but they're things I think about a lot. The question of redemption, who gets it, who's entitled to it, how they earn it. It's easy for me to go into this community and meet these guys, and when I meet them, we're joking around, and everything's well and good now, but I haven't lived under the conditions that they've set in these neighborhoods. I haven't lost a family member. I haven't been harmed by them. I haven't been threatened by them. It's a lot harder, I think, for the people who live in those communities to forgive, and I understand that. I would meet these guys, and we'd have a great time. We would joke around. We would compare tattoos. And you're making friends with guys with giant face tattoos and these scary gangs, and it feels great. But then you learn some of the stuff they've done, and they've done some horrible things. I'm not talking about just murdering somebody, torture, just like brutal things. And you really ask yourself, are these guys capable of forgiveness? Would I forgive them if some of these things happened to me? And I don't have any of the answers to any of these questions. They're just things that I've thought about. And a lot of people in El Salvador don't forgive them. They favor. There's been a resurgence of death squads in the country, police doing a lot of extrajudicial killing, and that has popular support in El Salvador. They have been terrorized. These people have torn the country apart, and they're not ready to forgive a lot of them. There are others, I met a young woman, I think she's probably 17 or 18 years old. We interviewed her, it wasn't included in this piece, that lost her mother to the gangs. And she is ready to forgive because she's like, this has to end. If the country doesn't forgive and try to find a way to move forward, we're never going to move. These cycles are going to keep going. But, I don't have an answer for that. Even if these guys are 100% serious, and I doubt you can say that all of them are. Some of them might just not want to go back to the gang. Some of them might not want to live in these harsh circumstances. Some of them might not want to pay their dues for the crimes they've committed. Even if they are 100% serious and they really dedicate them to living a positive life and don't harm anyone else, can you still forgive them? I don't know. You ask yourself these questions with justice in the U.S. How I think they recently declared it was unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to more than I think 20 years for a murder crime. And, that makes a lot of sense to me. These guys were 16, 17 years old. I've met guys like that. But what is the limit? What do you forgive? What is considered a sort of just sentence for some of these horrific crimes? Whether it's El Salvador, whether it's the US, I tend to be more forgiving, but again, I'm not a victim. So I think it's really, or the family member of a victim, I think it's a really tough question that a lot of people right now, especially in this country, are asking themselves when it comes to criminal justice and reform and all these things. And I do not have a good answer for that.
Yeah. There's recently been an election in El Salvador. Do you have a sense of how, if in any way, that is going to change the outlook for people in El Salvador, or how the new president is addressing some of these issues?
I don't. I think there's been some cautious optimism with him. I've spoken to some folks who are really thrilled that he's been elected and think he'll represent a new leaf. Others who just are like, yeah, he's corrupt like the rest of them. It's hard to say. The last party that was in power that really cracked down hard was the really leftist party that is made up of a group that were leftist or communist guerrillas in the 80s. And they were said to be, the voice of the people, the voice of the poor, who had, raised arms against the government, fought like a vicious battle against the government. I mean, the government was accused of many more human rights violations than they were, but their hands weren't clean, and they were supposed to be seen as the voice of the poor. And a lot of the poor think the government turned against them because they went, anyone in these neighborhoods now is suspected of being a gang member. You've got young men rounded up, abused by the police, like I said, death squads, all those things, and they sort of turned. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen to someone once they've taken power. This guy's young, he's a technocrat, but it's also the other question, right? How do you win elections in these countries? It's by taking a firm hand. It's by really saying you're going to go in after the gangs, you're going to go in hard. That's what wins elections, and unfortunately that doesn't really solve the problems. What solves the problems, in my opinion, is a dedication of resources of these programs that maybe you won't see results of for 20 years. But elections are what, every 4 years, every 6 years, every 2 years? People don't see results, you're not gonna win an election.
Yeah.
So it's really tough to, and I'm not saying that there shouldn't, obviously law enforcement's really important in these neighborhoods. Some of them want more police in their communities. So you've got to find this balance of actually putting in places and programs that will, change this cycle there of lack of opportunity, of lack of resources, but that takes time. At the same time, you can't completely give up on law enforcement and really policing these gangs because then they'll run amok. Yeah. It's a really hard situation to parse.
So I have two questions just to close this part of our conversation. The first is, given what you've seen and what you understand about El Salvador currently, we see these pockets of hope that you covered. Are the number of people who are looking to leave, is that likely to slow down, or do you anticipate that will continue?
I think it's weird because you really can't understand the number sometimes because it goes up and down. I think it's definitely going to continue. But from what I've been told, the numbers have actually decreased a bit as they wait to see what the new president's going to do and how effective he's going to be in handling some of these issues and bringing opportunity to the country. I think Honduras and Guatemala are still quite high. They have gang problems as well. Honduras, it's quite bad, not as bad as El Salvador. But there's also crushing poverty in these countries. Corrupt governments, repressive governments. Now you've got Nicaragua kicking off and more Nicaraguans fleeing. We have to kind of reckon too with the role that we've played in destabilizing some of these countries in the 80s. I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah. So we try our best, of course, as do you, right? I think, to orient ourselves towards hope in some capacity. Mm-hmm. And you've offered, I think, this brilliant little peeling back of some hope in El Salvador. How can we step forward in hope? What can we do that is a hopeful action vis-a-vis our brothers and sisters in El Salvador?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't have many answers. There are NGOs down there that do great work that obviously with the U.S. maybe pulling back funding that need all the help they can get. Grassroots organizations like Wilfredo. But even, I'm sure, Patterson's how far from here, I'm sure there's a Salvadoran community there right now that has similar issues that they do in El Salvador. I'm sure there are people there that are facing crushing poverty that can't get jobs here because they're not legal. And I'm sure that there are organizations there that need help as well. So, it might not involve going down to El Salvador or donating money to Wilfredo, which if you guys want to do that, I can definitely help that out for sure. He'll take all the help he can get. But I think there are people in our backyards, from these communities that need help. And I'm sure most people that come here from El Salvador, they're not just working for themselves here. They're working for their family back there. They're sending back remittances. They're trying to do everything they can to support their communities. Any help that can be provided for these people that are in our backyards, I think it would be beneficial to the country as well, even if it's something small.
Okay. So we can only go so long in this format. I hope that we can continue the conversation in the chapel during our second hour. Members, friends of Union Cong, I'm sure you would join me in expressing our gratitude to Danny for his work and for sharing some of his experiences with us today. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you so much.
That was great. Thanks a lot.